Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Chinidu's shoes clicked against the marble tiles of his luxurious home as he returned unexpectedly early from a board meeting in Ikoi. The mansion was unusually silent for the hour. No footsteps, no servants bustling, just a strange echo of calm. He loosened his tie, already bracing himself for another exhausting evening of silence and stares from his autistic son, Daniel. Normally, Daniel would be in his room, completely unresponsive to human presence unless his therapist was coaxing him through a failed routine. But as Chinidu turned the corner into the living room, he froze. His heart skipped. Before him, like a dream he didn't dare have, stood Daniel, swaying side to side, clapping offbeat to a tune he was trying to hum. And beside him was Amaka, the housemaid, smiling, singing softly, and holding Daniel's hands gently. Chinidu watched in disbelief as Daniel looked up, not around, not past, but into Amaka's eyes, and laughed. Chinidu blinked back tears, afraid the moment would vanish if he moved. For 3 years since Ebra died, Daniel had been a shadow, flinching from touch, afraid of sound, lost in his mind. Not once had he laughed. Not once had he danced. Therapists were rotated monthly, medications tried and abandoned. Even Chinidu himself had given up, believing the child he loved was locked away forever in silence. Yet here he was, dancing, singing, existing in the world, with nothing but Amaka's voice guiding him. Chinidu took a step closer, and Daniel turned toward him. Their eyes met. The boy blinked, tilted his head, then smiled. "Daddy," he said faintly. Chinidu fell to his knees as if something had crushed his chest. "Daddy, dance." The request was so soft yet so clear, it echoed through every crack of the billionaire's heart. Trembling, he rose and joined them, swaying beside his son, unsure of his steps, but following the music of miracle. That night, Chinidu didn't eat. He didn't take calls. He stood outside Daniel's door, watching Amaka sing the boy to sleep. She tucked him in like Ebra once did, same gentleness, same warmth. And for the first time since the funeral, Daniel fell asleep without crying. Chinidu sat in his study afterward, surrounded by millions in marble, glass, and leather, but none of them gave him what that girl's voice did. That night, something shifted in his soul. A light came on in the place that had long gone dark. He didn't know what tomorrow would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. Something had just been unlocked in his son, and perhaps in himself. The day Daniel was born, Chinidu had been in Dubai, signing a multi-million-dollar deal with foreign investors. His phone rang. He answered with a half-smile, expecting to hear the usual update from Ebra. But this time, her voice was shaking. "He's different," she whispered. "They say he doesn't respond to touch." Chinidu waved it off. "Maybe he's just tired. I'll be back next week." But when he returned and held the baby, Daniel did not reach out. His eyes drifted, not to the ceiling, not to Chinidu's face, just away. It felt like holding a soul not fully present. The pediatrician mentioned delayed response and neurological patterns. Ebra was calm, hopeful. She researched therapies, nutrition, stimulation. Chinidu, however, shut down emotionally. He buried himself in work, appearing at home only when required, treating fatherhood like another project to manage with money. As the months passed, Daniel's condition became clearer. He didn't speak his first word. He didn't crawl when expected. He screamed when touched by strangers. The diagnosis came like a quiet bomb: autism spectrum disorder, severe. Chinidu stared at the report with hollow eyes. What did that mean for a billionaire who was used to fixing everything? He flew in specialists from abroad, hired the most expensive behavioral therapists, enrolled Daniel in a top private school with neurodivergent support. But no matter how much he spent, nothing worked. The boy remained locked away. Other children laughed behind Daniel's back. Some ran from him when he flapped his hands or made strange noises. Teachers whispered to each other during parent-teacher meetings. Daniel became aggressive, not out of violence, but out of fear. When touched, he shrieked. When forced, he hit. Soon, he was isolated in class, learning nothing, feared by many. And Ebra, sweet Ebra, she never gave up. She sat with Daniel for hours, rocking him through his meltdowns, singing gently until he calmed. Chinidu saw her strength and marveled at it, even envied it. But he couldn't connect. He didn't know how. There were nights when he stood at the door, watching her cradle Daniel through his screams, and wished he could trade places with her just to understand. But all he ever offered was security, the best cameras, the best therapists, the best private doctors. Yet none of it could replace the warmth of a human heart. That reality haunted Chinidu every time he watched his son shrink from the world. The weight of his son's silence was heavier than any corporate failure. He had conquered industries, but couldn't reach his own child. Years before Daniel was born, long before the marble floors and private jets, Chinidu was just a reckless, arrogant playboy in a fast car with a diamond wristwatch and no brakes. He lived in nightclubs, flirted with models, tossed money like confetti, and swore he'd never be tied down. Women were toys, and emotions were weaknesses. Until one rainy afternoon, when he stormed into a campus canteen for cover, barking at a waitress for being too slow. A soft-spoken girl with rough palms and tired eyes handed him a paper towel, without a word. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, annoyed. "I don't need to," she replied. "Pride doesn't clean stains." That was how Chinidu met Ebra, the woman who would redefine everything he thought he knew about love. At first, he pursued her like every other girl. Expensive gifts, dinners, grand gestures. She rejected all of it. "If you want to talk, talk. But I'm not for sale," she once told him. Chinidu was stunned. It was the first time his money had no power. So, for the first time, he tried something new, listening. He asked about her dreams. She told him she wanted to run a small bookshop for children. He asked about her past. She spoke of growing up with 4 siblings, sharing a single pair of shoes. He watched her laugh with strangers, help old women cross streets, play with children that weren't hers. And slowly, Chinidu stopped buying her things and started giving her time. She taught him that wealth meant nothing without compassion. That power without humility was poison. Their love wasn't fast, but it was real. He fell in love with her simplicity, her stubborn morals, her soft but unshakable strength. Ebra taught him to say sorry, to pause, to care. They got married in a small ceremony with only 12 guests. No celebrities, no press. She became his peace. When Daniel was born, and they realized he was different, Ebra didn't cry. She smiled and said, "God gave us a puzzle, and we'll solve it with love." Chinidu, still learning how to love, clung to her strength. But he didn't know how much he needed her until she was gone. After her death, nothing could fill the silence she left behind. Not the mansion, not the money, not even Daniel. And for years, Chinidu wandered in grief, until one maid hummed a familiar lullaby and reminded him that Ebra's voice had never really left. When Daniel was born, Chinidu had never seen a quieter baby. There were no loud cries in the delivery room, no flailing limbs or excited kicks. Ebra held him tightly, whispering that he was perfect, even when the nurses exchanged uneasy glances. In the early months, Daniel rarely responded to sound. He didn't track movements with his eyes, didn't giggle like other babies. Ebra remained calm, nurturing him with an unmatched patience that amazed even the pediatricians. But Chinidu grew uneasy. Friends started commenting on how quiet the boy was. A neighbor suggested checking his hearing. One doctor dismissed the concerns as late development, but another was blunt. There may be neurological delays. At first, Chinidu didn't understand what that meant. But by the time Daniel turned 2 and still hadn't said a single word or shown signs of bonding with other kids, the reality became difficult to ignore. Daniel never liked being touched, not even by his own father. Chinidu would try to carry him, but the child would stiffen, twist away, or shriek until he was put down. The rejection cut deeper than Chinidu admitted, and over time, he stopped trying. His business meetings took priority again. Let the nannies handle him, he often told himself. Meanwhile, Ebra remained the only connection Daniel allowed. She knew how to soothe him when he had meltdowns, how to notice when he was about to break, and how to speak to him without words. She created games tailored to his mind, painted pictures with him, built a world in which he felt safe. At school, however, it was a different story. His first day ended in chaos. A boy mocked the way he clapped. Another called him crazy. He came home with scratches on his arm. Ebra fought for him at every parent-teacher meeting, but it was clear, Daniel did not belong in a typical school environment. Chinidu started blaming himself, not openly, but in the quiet. He often wondered if his past wild life, the reckless years of womanizing and clubbing, had cursed his son's future. He had built empires, but could not teach his own child how to smile. Daniel grew up in isolation. Birthday parties were short and awkward. Family events were skipped. Guests found him odd. And soon, Daniel began to retreat from the world entirely. He didn't speak. He didn't play. When Ebra fell sick, his confusion turned into deeper fear. She could no longer sing every night. There were days she couldn't even rise from bed. Daniel sat beside her, quiet, frightened. The one anchor in his world was slipping, and he had no way of understanding why. When she died, his eyes didn't tear up. He simply stopped responding to anyone. Not even the therapist could bring him back. Ebra's illness came like an uninvited guest, quietly, then cruelly. It began with fatigue, then bleeding, then pain so unbearable she could hardly stand. Chinidu rushed her from one hospital to the next, sparing no expense. Scans, tests, and experimental treatments followed. The diagnosis, stage 4 cervical cancer. It was too advanced, too aggressive. Ebra, always the calm one, took the news with a deep breath. "I'm not afraid to die," she told him one evening, resting her head on his chest. "I'm just afraid of leaving Daniel." Chinidu didn't respond. He couldn't. Because in all his years of fighting boardroom battles, this was one war he couldn't win. He began staying home more, watching his wife grow weaker by the day. She stopped attending therapy sessions with Daniel. Her voice grew faint. Yet, even on her worst days, she smiled for Daniel. In her final weeks, Ebra made recordings, soft lullabies, messages for Daniel, stories they used to read together. She recorded a short video, her face pale but warm. "Daniel, my love," she said into the camera, "if you ever feel lost, remember Mummy's song. You are not alone." Chinidu watched her record it through tears. She gave instructions for her burial, simple, quiet, private. She didn't want long speeches or mournful choirs. She wanted Daniel protected, loved, and safe. But even in her death, her instructions couldn't protect him fully. When she passed away in her sleep, Daniel was the first to find her. He stood at the doorway, watching her chest still, unmoving. Then he turned and walked away in silence, returning to his toys. When Chinidu found out, he collapsed onto her bedside, sobbing. That day, their home became a cold, echoing palace of grief. In the months after her burial, everything fell apart. Daniel refused to eat sometimes. He didn't react when spoken to. He stopped going to school. Therapists were rotated frequently, each one claiming to have a method. But Daniel saw through all of them. The one person he wanted was gone. Chinidu became a stranger in his own home. A man pacing in corridors lined with portraits of a woman he couldn't replace and a son he couldn't reach. Every night, he sat in the dim living room with a glass of wine and Ebra's recordings playing on loop. Sometimes, Daniel would wander close, sit at the corner of the couch, and hum softly to himself. But the moment anyone tried to reach him, he would bolt. In those moments, Chinidu realized that his wealth could buy anything, except healing. After Ebra's death, people started suggesting that Chinidu should move on. Business friends invited him to social events, introducing him to decent women they swore would fill the void. At first, he refused. But as the loneliness deepened, he gave in. The women came in waves, all stunning, well-spoken, perfectly dressed. They came with smiles and sweet words. Some cried fake tears for Ebra. Others promised to love Daniel like their own. But none of them lasted. The moment they realized Daniel didn't hug back, didn't speak, and didn't play, their patience wore thin. One girlfriend insisted he send Daniel away to a care home so we can focus on our relationship. Another pretended to love the boy, but was caught yelling at him by a nanny. None of them wanted Daniel. They wanted Chinidu's wealth and the title of Mrs. Obiora. One woman, in particular, stayed longer than the rest. Sandra. She was elegant, ambitious, and dangerously beautiful. Chinidu met her at a charity gala, and she immediately stood out. She seemed warm. She complimented Daniel in public and made an effort to learn about autism, or so it appeared. But behind closed doors, Sandra grew colder. She treated Daniel like an inconvenience. Whenever Chinidu was away, she isolated the boy. Once, she was caught locking him in a closet because he had spilled juice on her dress. When confronted, she laughed it off. It's discipline. You treat him like he's glass, but he's just spoiled. Chinidu, overwhelmed by grief and desperate for normalcy, let it slide. He didn't want to believe she was like the rest. But deep down, he knew Ebra would have seen through her in minutes. As Daniel's condition worsened, the mansion became a battlefield of passive-aggressive exchanges. The staff whispered. The boy shrank further into silence. And Chinidu, he simply watched. He buried himself in work, drowning in back-to-back deals just to avoid seeing the broken pieces of what used to be a family. At night, Daniel often curled up alone in the corner of his room. On better days, he would hum to himself. On bad days, he would scream for hours. But one day, something changed. A new maid arrived, quiet, respectful, and overlooked by almost everyone. Her name was Amaka. No one paid attention to her presence until the day she began to sing. Sandra had the kind of beauty that silenced rooms, tall, elegant, with perfectly styled wigs and heels that clicked like a signature. To the outside world, she was the ideal woman to help Chinidu move forward, a successful entrepreneur with a confident smile and a fashionable presence beside the grieving billionaire. In public, she played her role effortlessly. She gave interviews about supporting families with special needs, posed for glossy magazines with Chinidu, and threw charity events in Daniel's name. People applauded her as a symbol of strength. But within the Obiora mansion, Sandra's mask cracked often, especially when no one was watching. To her, Daniel was a burden, an obstacle between her and a throne she believed was rightfully hers. She despised the way he flapped his hands, his long silences, his sudden outbursts. And more than anything, she despised how he reminded Chinidu of Ebra. When Chinidu was around, Sandra transformed into a doting mother figure, touching Daniel's hair, calling him my baby, feeding him with exaggerated care. But the moment Chinidu left for meetings or retired upstairs, Sandra's entire energy shifted. Her tone turned sharp. Her touch turned cold. She would hiss at Daniel to sit still and pinch his arm if he made a sound. On one occasion, a house staff member overheard her mocking the boy, calling him a spoiled, useless excuse for a child, and threatening to have him shipped off the moment she became the lady of the house. Amaka, still new at the time, witnessed one of these outbursts. Her eyes widened with disbelief, but she said nothing, not yet. She wasn't sure of her place, but deep inside her, something began to burn. She couldn't let this continue. Despite the darkness she brought, Sandra was blind to her unraveling. She grew bolder, confident that Chinidu's affection blinded him completely. She began redecorating the house, erasing Ebra's touches bit by bit. The quiet corner where Ebra used to sit with Daniel was turned into a wine bar. Family photos were replaced with portraits of herself and Chinidu. And yet, Chinidu began noticing small things, Daniel flinching more often, crying at night, shrinking away from Sandra's touch. Something wasn't right. He wanted to believe it was just Daniel's condition worsening, but in his heart, he knew better. Still, he remained silent, partly from confusion, partly from guilt. But all of that would begin to shift soon, thanks to the one person nobody had expected to matter, the maid who dared to sing. Amaka arrived at the mansion quietly, no makeup, no designer clothes, no fanfare. Just a plain brown box of belongings, worn sandals, and a simple smile. She was in her early 20s, dark-skinned with soft eyes, and a voice so calm it felt like breeze. The head housekeeper had found her through a church referral. She was looking for work to support her younger siblings. Her records were clean, references strong, and she asked for no favors. Most of the staff barely noticed her those first few weeks. She worked diligently, mopping floors, folding clothes, washing dishes, always humming under her breath. It was the humming that caught Daniel's attention. He would pause in the hallway when he heard it, hiding behind the banister, watching her from afar like a deer studying something unfamiliar yet comforting. Amaka noticed, but never forced anything. She simply smiled whenever he peeked out and continued humming. The first time they truly connected was unexpected. Daniel had wandered into the laundry room during one of his quiet episodes. No one noticed except Amaka. She saw him sitting in the corner, hugging his knees. She didn't panic. She didn't speak. She just sat on the opposite side of a room and began folding towels and humming a tune. It was one of the folk songs from her village, slow, soothing, and filled with memory. To her surprise, Daniel began rocking gently. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply listened. That moment was small but significant. Amaka didn't report it to anyone. She didn't see it as a breakthrough, just a moment of peace for a boy she had started to care about. But in that peace, a bond had quietly been born. From then on, Amaka became more than a maid to Daniel. She became a presence, consistent, gentle, and safe. She never touched him without warning, never forced conversation. She greeted him softly, left snacks near his favorite corners, and always hummed when she was nearby. Daniel began seeking her out, walking quietly behind her in the halls, sitting near her in the kitchen. Amaka never bragged, never told the others what was happening. But Sandra noticed. She began to scowl when Amaka was in the room. She once warned her to know your place and stay out of my family business. Amaka only nodded, but deep down, she knew the tides were beginning to turn, not just for her, but for Daniel. And for a house that had known nothing but sorrow, hope was starting to whisper again. School was never kind to Daniel. From the beginning, he stood out in all the wrong ways. While other children read aloud, played in groups, or drew pictures for their parents, Daniel sat in the corner with his noise-canceling headphones, rocking back and forth. He flapped his hands when overwhelmed and often hummed loudly to calm himself. These habits were innocent, ways his mind coped with the world, but to children they were strange. He's weird, one girl whispered. He acts like a robot, a boy laughed. It didn't take long before Daniel became the target of cruel jokes. His school bag was once thrown in a puddle. A teacher found him crying silently behind the school generator, soaked and trembling. When asked what happened, he couldn't form the words to explain. And even when he tried, his speech came out broken, a stutter mixed with confusion and fear. Chinidu received reports often, but they were sterile, academic progress sheets filled with neutral phrases like struggles with interaction, or shows limited verbal participation. No one truly told him the extent of the damage. The teachers were overwhelmed, the school poorly equipped to handle special needs. But it was Amaka who began noticing the bruises. Small ones on Daniel's arm, scratches near his elbow. When she asked gently, Daniel didn't speak, but he shook his head violently and curled into a ball. That night, Amaka sat in the boys' room, singing to him softly. He clung to her shirt and refused to let go. When Chinidu walked in later and saw them curled together on the floor, something inside him twisted. It had been years since he saw his son willingly touch anyone. The image haunted him long after he returned to his room. Sandra, of course, had a different solution. "We should send him to a facility," she said bluntly. "A special home. He'll get better help there. And let's be honest, it'll give us space to have a real life." Amaka overheard her and couldn't hold back. "He doesn't need to be hidden away like he's a mistake," she said firmly. "He needs love, not isolation." It was the first time she challenged Sandra openly. Chinidu stood in the middle, torn between logic and emotion. But something about Amaka's tone reminded him of Ebra, firm, protective, unbending in love. That evening, he sat with Daniel longer than usual, just watching him breathe. Then he whispered into the quiet, "I won't let them take you." Daniel stirred in his sleep, and for the first time in weeks, reached out a small hand toward Amaka's lullaby, still echoing in the hallway. That evening was unlike any other in the Obiora mansion. A quiet drizzle washed the windows, and the electricity had gone out temporarily, plunging the estate into a gentle darkness lit only by backup lights and candle glow. Amaka, never one to panic in silence, continued her chores humming a soft lullaby, the same one she'd picked up from an old woman in her village who used to sing it during harvest. It was a song of calm, slow and melodic, layered with something older than words. She hummed it as she wiped down the dining table, unaware that a tiny shadow had emerged from behind the curtains. Daniel. He stood there watching her, eyes wide, chest rising and falling, fixated not on her movements, but on her voice. Without realizing it, Amaka was reaching into the deepest corners of a child no one else had managed to touch. Daniel walked closer, very slowly, drawn not by fear, but by comfort. As Amaka bent to pick up a napkin, she felt a gentle tug on the hem of her wrapper. She turned and froze, not out of fear, but awe. There he was, eyes blinking fast, hands flapping, but calm. "More," he whispered, voice cracked with disuse. "Sing more." Amaka dropped to her knees. She didn't cry, though she wanted to. She just nodded and began singing again, this time looking into his eyes. Daniel clapped softly, out of rhythm, but full of joy. Then he began to hum along. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't melodic. But it was connection, real and raw. For a boy who hadn't said a full word in months, who had shut the entire world out since his mother's death, this was a beginning. Not even Amaka could comprehend what she had unlocked. Unknown to them, Chinidu had walked in through the hallway just then, silent and exhausted from another series of frustrating meetings. He was heading to his room when he heard laughter. Not just any laughter, Daniel's laughter. He paused, heart racing, confused. He followed the sound cautiously until he reached the edge of the dining room and saw it. Daniel clapping, dancing slightly, his eyes locked on Amaka, who was singing gently, nodding in encouragement. Chinidu leaned against the wall, stunned, unable to speak. His knees nearly gave way. His son was happy. Not drugged, not coaxed by a therapist. Happy, naturally, fully. It was a moment worth more than any deal he'd ever signed. That night, when Amaka tucked Daniel into bed, he said one phrase before drifting to sleep. "Mummy song." And for the first time in 3 years, Chinidu cried not out of grief, but out of hope. The morning after the musical miracle, everything in the house felt different, warmer, gentler, as though even the walls had heard Daniel's hums. Amaka rose early, already preparing breakfast with her usual grace, but something lingered in her spirit. She couldn't forget the way Daniel looked at her, the way he said more, the way he held onto the last note of her lullaby, like a lifeline. She wasn't a doctor, nor did she claim to have magic, but she believed in the power of presence, and that belief was beginning to show its fruit. Daniel woke up early that morning too, something the house staff noted as unusual. He walked into the kitchen silently, still holding the small blue blanket his mother had given him before she died. Amaka turned, smiled, and asked gently, "Hungry?" He nodded. She gave him 2 pancakes, and as he sat beside her, he whispered again, "Mummy song." Word reached Chinidu almost immediately. At first, he dismissed it as a hopeful exaggeration, the kind house staff sometimes repeated to make him feel better. But when he returned home that evening and opened the front door, he was met not by silence or forced greetings, but by the soft sound of his son's voice singing off-key. La la la, Mummy song. It wasn't full sentences. It wasn't a perfect melody, but it was unmistakably Daniel. The boy was in the living room, barefoot, rocking side to side with Amaka, both of them humming together. Chinidu froze. Then Daniel saw him, and something incredible happened. The boy stopped, turned to his father, and said softly but clearly, "Daddy, dance." The words broke through every guarded layer in Chinidu's heart. It was more than a request. It was an invitation into his son's world. Chinidu walked forward slowly, like a man approaching a sacred place. His eyes were already filling with tears, his hands trembling. Amaka stepped aside, giving father and son room. For the first time in his life, Chinidu danced, not for cameras, not at a wedding, not in celebration, but for love. He swayed with his son, clapping gently, unsure of the rhythm, but holding on to the moment like a lifeline. Daniel giggled and mirrored his movements. Amaka watched silently, tears in her eyes, arms folded as if cradling something fragile inside her. That night, Chinidu didn't return to his study. He sat on Daniel's bed, reading aloud one of Ebra's old storybooks. When Daniel fell asleep with a smile on his face, Chinidu leaned against the doorframe and whispered, "Thank you," not to any person, but to Ebra, to God, and unknowingly to Amaka. From that day forward, Chinidu saw Amaka through a new lens. No longer just a maid, she had become something far greater, a healer, a bridge between past and present, a vessel of the peace he had buried with Ebra. He started noticing little things, how she always waited before speaking to Daniel, how she watched him for cues, not commands. She reminded him so much of his late wife at heart, not in appearance, but in spirit. Amaka was patient, warm, and invisible in the most graceful way. She never demanded anything, yet she had given everything. For the first time since Ebra's death, the mansion began to feel like a home again. The staff moved more gently, Daniel began humming more often, and even Chinidu's breathing seemed easier. He started spending more time at home, sometimes cutting meetings short just to get back in time for dinner. One evening, he walked into the kitchen and found Amaka cooking yam porridge while Daniel sat nearby, painting with fingers dipped in food coloring. The entire scene looked like something out of a dream, messy, colorful, and full of life. Chinidu didn't interrupt. He simply sat down and watched. Amaka glanced at him, her smile soft, her eyes kind. That evening, they all ate together at the same table. It was awkward at first. Chinidu wasn't used to silence without phones or noise, but Amaka made it natural. She told a silly story from her village about a goat that got drunk on palm wine, and Daniel laughed so loudly Chinidu dropped a spoon in shock. Something inside him shifted that night. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't romantic, but it was deep, the beginning of something quiet and steady. He began asking Amaka questions about her family, her village, her dreams. He found himself lingering longer in rooms she occupied, just listening to her speak. She never overstepped, never assumed intimacy, but Chinidu could feel the change growing inside him. It wasn't about beauty or desire. It was something deeper, something Ebra once gave him, peace. And the more he felt it, the more he feared it, because peace had cost him dearly before. But Amaka wasn't trying to replace Ebra. She wasn't trying at all. And maybe, just maybe, that was what made her irreplaceable. Sandra had always been confident, dangerously so. She knew how to capture attention, how to play the perfect public role. But over time, she began to feel something slipping away from her grasp, something she couldn't name until it was too late. Chinidu's eyes no longer lingered when she walked into a room. His attention, once tethered to her movements, was now somewhere else, and it was obvious to her where. Amaka, the quiet, dark-skinned maid with no pedigree, no family name, and no matching lace at society weddings. It infuriated her. Sandra had endured Daniel's strange behavior, his silence, and his sudden outbursts for months, all in hopes of marrying into wealth. But now, the very boy she once tolerated had become the very reason she was losing control. The shift was undeniable. Chinidu smiled more when Amaka was around. He laughed with Daniel more often. He even started having long, late conversations with Amaka in the garden, where once Sandra alone had access. What was worse, the house staff, people Sandra believed feared her, had begun to soften around Amaka, whispering about her like she was a blessing to the home. One afternoon, Sandra walked into the living room to see Daniel sitting beside Amaka, his small hands wrapped around her wrist as she hummed to him. Sandra's eyes burned. When Amaka noticed her standing there, Sandra sneered, stepped forward, and hissed, "You forget yourself. You're a maid, not his mother." Amaka didn't flinch. She looked Sandra in the eye and replied softly, "And yet, he feels safer with me than with you." Those words lit a flame in Sandra she could no longer contain. From that day, her actions became more sinister. She began yelling more at staff, demanding they limit Amaka's movements. She accused her of stealing attention, then of manipulating the boy to gain sympathy. One evening, Amaka caught Sandra tightly gripping Daniel's arm when he spilled water near the dining table. Daniel whimpered, his eyes wide with terror. Amaka rushed in, pulled the boy away, and stood between them. "Don't touch him again," she warned, her voice steady. Sandra, furious, slapped the air just inches from Amaka's face, but the maid did not move. Chinidu walked in just then, catching only the aftermath. Sandra immediately turned it into a performance, claiming Amaka had disrespected her, that she was losing control of the house. But Chinidu, now more observant, was no longer so easily swayed. He watched Amaka calmly take Daniel to his room and began questioning himself for the first time. Had he allowed a snake to live too long under his roof? Daniel's birthday arrived quietly, without fanfare, without the over-the-top planning Ebra used to do. He turned 9 that day, but no one in the mansion seemed to notice, not even Chinidu, at first. He was swamped with business calls, handling crises in 2 international branches. Sandra, on the other hand, noticed, but not for the right reasons. She used it as a chance to host a private networking brunch disguised as a birthday celebration. She invited influencers, a few elite friends, and had the house redecorated in pastel blue and white. But Daniel was excluded. He was locked in his room for most of it, so he wouldn't embarrass anyone. Amaka, forbidden from speaking to guests, watched silently from the kitchen as the so-called party played out. All glitter, zero sincerity. Daniel remained in his room, holding a crumpled drawing he had made of himself, his mother, and Amaka standing under a crooked rainbow. He didn't understand why the music outside didn't include him, why no one had given him a hug. He hummed to himself to stay calm, rocking as the noise filtered through his walls. Amaka couldn't bear it any longer. After helping serve food to guests, she sneaked into the backyard with a small cupcake she had baked earlier. She found Daniel sitting under the avocado tree and placed the cupcake in his hand, whispering, "Happy birthday, Daniel." The boy blinked at her, then broke into a soft smile. She lit a single candle and sang the lullaby slowly. When he blew it out, he said, "Best day." Chinidu returned home that evening to find leftover champagne bottles and an empty living room. Sandra was gloating about the success of the party. "Everyone loved it," she said, tossing her heels off carelessly. But something fell off. The house didn't feel festive. He walked upstairs and heard humming from the backyard. There, under the tree, Amaka sat beside Daniel, his head on her lap. The cupcake wrapper rested by his side, and his drawing was now folded in her palm. Chinidu walked closer and sat beside them, without saying a word. Daniel stirred, looked at his father, and said, "Mummy's song is now Amaka's song." And just like that, Chinidu realized he had missed the one celebration that truly mattered. That night, he sat in his room replaying the scene in his mind. He had thrown million-dollar parties, but none had ever been this pure. The days that followed Daniel's birthday were tense. Chinidu began observing Sandra more carefully, noting her tone around Daniel, her subtle distance when no one watched. She started sensing his withdrawal, which only made her more possessive. She tried to seduce him back into her control, organizing a romantic dinner in the master balcony suite. But even there, Chinidu found his mind drifting, not to business, not to passion, but to Daniel's laughter under the avocado tree. "You're quiet," Sandra noted with irritation. "Is something wrong?" He answered with silence. The spell was broken. Later that night, Chinidu walked past Daniel's room and found Amaka reading to him by flashlight, the boy smiling with sleepy eyes. He stood there watching the scene, the way Amaka smoothed Daniel's blanket, her voice soft and steady, and something shattered inside him. He had made a mistake trusting Sandra. The next morning, Amaka entered the house visibly shaken. She found Daniel curled in the corner of the hallway, shaking. His sleeves were wrinkled and his eyes filled with tears. "What happened?" she asked, heart racing. He muttered, "Sandra bad, no touch." That was all he could say. Amaka checked his arms and noticed a fresh bruise. Rage and fear clashed in her heart. She stormed into the study and confronted Chinidu. She heard him, she said. her voice trembling but unshaken. Again. And I've stayed quiet too long. Do something before she does worse. Chinidu blinked in disbelief. He called in the house manager, checked CCTV records, and began connecting the dots. But when confronted, Sandra twisted everything. He bruises himself all the time, she shouted. She's turning him against me. She's manipulating this entire house. The confrontation ended in a storm. Sandra threatened to leave, then cried, then demanded a proposal date. Chinidu stood there, quiet, numb. Something had broken that couldn't be repaired. Later that night, he found Amaka in the kitchen, wiping tears silently. He didn't speak. He just stood beside her, took a deep breath and whispered, "I'm sorry I ever doubted you." And for the first time, Amaka let herself cry, not from pain, but from the relief that someone was finally listening. Neither of them knew what Sandra had planned next, but the storm hadn't passed. It was only beginning. The mansion slept under a thick veil of silence, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of distant crickets and the hum of the generator outside. But somewhere within those walls, evil stirred. Sandra paced her room barefoot, her once pristine makeup smudged from crying and drinking. Rejection had never been part of her story. She had built her image, invested her time, endured Daniel's strangeness, all for a seat beside Chinidu as his wife. But now everything was slipping. That maid, that lowly, barefoot, soft-spoken Amaka had taken everything. The boy, the man, the household, and worse. Chinidu had started locking his door at night and ignoring her messages. Sandra's thoughts twisted into something dark. She opened her drawer slowly and pulled out a pillow, her nails digging into the fabric. Tonight would be the end of Amaka. Amaka had fallen asleep early. It had been a long, emotional day, helping Daniel settle after his episodes of anxiety. She didn't hear the soft creak of the door. Sandra tiptoed in like a shadow, with vengeance in her breath. Her face was wild with quiet fury, and her hands trembled as she moved closer to the bed. Slowly, she lowered the pillow toward Amaka's face, whispering venomous words. "You ruined everything. You think this is a fairy tale? You will never take my place." But just before the pillow made contact, the door creaked again. Sandra froze. A small figure stood at the doorway, eyes wide, mouth agape. Daniel. His hands flapped uncontrollably. He screamed, a loud, guttural sound that echoed through the mansion like a siren. The entire house jolted awake. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Chinidu, still in his nightwear, burst into the room and found Sandra crouched beside Amaka's bed, pillow in hand, and Daniel screaming, pointing at her. Amaka was sitting upright now, gasping, confused and terrified. "What's going on here?" Chinidu barked. Sandra stood up quickly, trying to fake composure. "She's lying," she shouted, flinging the pillow to the floor. "This boy is confused. They're both turning you against me." But the damage was done. Chinidu turned to his son, still shaking in Amaka's arms. "Did she try to hurt her?" he asked softly. Daniel nodded, still trembling. Chinidu turned to Sandra with a coldness she had never seen before. "You're finished," he whispered. "Get out." But Sandra didn't leave quietly. She screamed, threatened, begged. Eventually, security dragged her out as she kicked and cursed. That night, Chinidu stayed beside Amaka, not just to protect her, but because he realized, for the first time in a long time, he was truly afraid of losing someone again. By morning, Sandra's photos were all over the tabloids. Chinidu Obiora's girlfriend caught in shocking attempted assault. The headline screamed. Videos leaked of her being escorted from the mansion, hair disheveled, eyes wild. Within hours, her brand partnerships collapsed. Sponsors withdrew, and friends distanced themselves. The charity organizations she once paraded dropped her name. Chinidu didn't comment to the press. He simply handed over evidence, including security footage of Sandra previously yanking Daniel's arm and entering Amaka's room at midnight. His legal team moved swiftly. Charges were pressed. Sandra's screams of innocence meant nothing. For once, power and justice weren't in her favor. But inside the mansion, none of that mattered. What mattered most was the boy who saved a life, the boy everyone once thought couldn't speak or understand, was now the hero of the home. Chinidu stayed close to Amaka in the following days. He ensured she had security nearby, made sure her room was moved closer to Daniel's, and personally handled her meals when she was too shaken to eat. But Amaka, though fragile in spirit, was stronger than she appeared. She resumed work like nothing happened, humming softly again by the third day. Daniel was more protective now. He never left her side. He followed her like a small shadow, often clinging to her wrapper. When she cooked, he stirred the pot. When she washed, he held the cloth. And every night, he made her sing the lullaby before falling asleep. The bond had gone beyond protection. It had become healing, mutual, and rooted in trust. And through it all, Chinidu watched with awe. He had never seen love expressed in such purity. One evening, Chinidu called for Amaka. She entered his study quietly, unsure if he was going to reprimand her for not resting. Instead, he handed her a folded piece of paper. "It's a letter of promotion," he said, his voice low. "I want you to stop cleaning floors. I want you to manage this house, as its heart, not its servant." Amaka looked down, tears rising. "I don't need a title, sir. I just want Daniel to be okay." Chinidu stepped closer. "But you need to be okay too," he whispered, "because this home wouldn't have survived without you." The moment was thick with unsaid things. Amaka nodded, still holding back tears. That night, Daniel made space for Chinidu to sit beside him and Amaka during their story session. And when the boy yawned and curled up, he whispered again, "Best day." For the first time in his life, Chinidu believed him. Weeks passed. The air in the mansion had changed, no longer tense and cold, but warm, filled with quiet laughter, shared meals, and peaceful evenings. Chinidu began rediscovering what it meant to live. He no longer rushed to work or skipped family moments. He began helping Daniel with art, poorly at first, and taking long walks with Amaka in the backyard garden. Sometimes they said nothing. Sometimes they talked about everything. Chinidu learned that Amaka lost her father young, raised her siblings while cleaning offices, and had always dreamed of becoming a teacher. "You already are," he told her once, as she calmed Daniel through a meltdown at a supermarket. "You're just not standing in a classroom." Amaka blushed and shook her head. But that night, she went to bed feeling like someone finally saw her, not as help, but as human. One Friday evening, Chinidu surprised them both with a family picnic. No staff, no cameras, just a quiet trip to a lake outside Lagos. Daniel wore shorts and rubber sandals, his sketch pad in hand. Amaka wore a soft floral gown, her hair in gentle braids. They ate jollof rice under a mango tree, watched birds, and even flew a small kite together. At one point, Daniel tripped and scraped his knee. Amaka rushed to him, gently cleaning the wound while humming. Chinidu watched, not with fear, but with joy. The boy didn't scream or flinch. He let Amaka comfort him. That evening, as they packed up to return home, Daniel reached for both of their hands and held them tightly. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. They were a family now, unfinished, imperfect, but whole in a way Chinidu had forgotten was possible. Later that night, as Daniel slept soundly for the first time in months, Chinidu stood in the hallway outside Amaka's door. He knocked gently. When she opened, surprised, he didn't say anything at first. Then, softly, he said, "May I take you out not as your boss, but as a man who is finally breathing again?" Amaka stared, speechless, tears forming in her eyes. Then she nodded. Yes. It wasn't a grand moment. There was no music, no speech. But it was real. And for Chinidu, who had known so much loss, and for Amaka, who had known so much invisibility, this was enough. They were no longer pieces scattered in sorrow. They were beginning to come together, not by force, but by love. It was a quiet Sunday evening when Chinidu decided it was time. No media, no guests, no extravagance, just a dimly lit garden at the back of the mansion where Daniel first smiled again. The flowers were in bloom, the air rich with the scent of hibiscus and earth. Amaka stood by the table, dressed simply in a sky-blue lace gown that fluttered in the breeze. Daniel sat on a wooden stool beside her, humming softly and sketching stars in a notebook. Chinidu approached slowly, holding a small velvet box in his palm, not as a billionaire trying to impress, but as a man humbled by grief and awakened by love. He knelt down, heart thudding in his chest, and whispered, "I once thought I would never love again. But you showed me the kind of love that doesn't shout or shine. It sings quietly, until it heals everything." Amaka covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Her eyes pooled with tears. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. "You gave me a home." But Chinidu shook his head gently. "No," he said. "You gave me a home when I lost the day Ebra died. And Daniel, he found his voice because of you." He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold band, engraved with the words, "To the one who listened." Daniel looked up from his drawing, his small voice breaking the stillness. "Mummy, say yes." Amaka burst into tears. She fell to her knees beside Daniel, wrapped her arms around him, and nodded toward Chinidu. "Yes, yes, I will." Chinidu exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. No fireworks, no applause, just a whisper of wind and a new beginning, woven in peace. The weeks that followed were filled with joy, so gentle it barely felt real. Chinidu and Amaka planned a quiet wedding, inviting only close friends, a few of Ebra's family members, and the house staff who had stood by through the years. Even the garden where Daniel once rocked silently now had a swing set and benches. Daniel smiled more, drew more, and even started attending a new school, one that nurtured rather than shunned. Chinidu didn't care about headlines anymore. He had found a song in his heart again, and this time it was one he didn't want to silence. And Amaka? She no longer wore a maid's uniform. She now moved through the house as a woman fully seen, loved, trusted, and cherished, not for what she did, but for who she was. The wedding day arrived, modest, heartfelt, and beautiful. The garden was adorned with fresh white lilies, a tribute to Ebra's favorite flower. A portrait of her stood quietly near the altar, smiling, not as a ghost of the past, but as a blessing over the future. Chinidu wore a soft gray bata, elegant but understated. Amaka, radiant in a cream-colored dress with simple gold jewelry, walked slowly toward him under the shade of swaying trees. But it was Daniel who stole the moment. Dressed in a miniature suit, he walked ahead of them, holding the rings, his steps confident, his eyes full of peace. Guests stood in awe. They had heard of his progress, but seeing him, calm, joyful, grounded, was a miracle none could deny. As the vows were exchanged, Daniel stood between them, holding both their hands. Chinidu's voice trembled as he said, "Ebra once taught me how to love. You, Amaka, taught me how to keep it." Amaka responded with tears in her voice. "You and Daniel were once broken pieces. But in your silence, I heard the most beautiful song. I just sang it back." The officiant gave the final blessing, and the couple kissed to the sound of gentle applause. Then came the moment no one expected. Daniel stepped forward, turned to the guests, and spoke clearly into the microphone. "That's my mummy now." Silence swept through the garden. Then came tears from staff, from family, even from strangers. The boy who once couldn't speak had said everything. Later that evening, Chinidu stood alone for a moment, looking up at the sky. "Thank you, Ebra," he whispered. "We're okay now." Behind him, Amaka and Daniel danced barefoot in the grass, laughing as if healing were a rhythm that never stopped. The mansion, once a hollow echo of sorrow, was now filled with new sounds. Daniel's laughter, Amaka's lullabies, Chinidu's footsteps down hallways no longer empty. It was never the money that saved them. It wasn't therapy or fame or time. It was one soft voice that dared to sing, and the heart that finally answered. And in that answer, they found forever. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.